Ja.
Dann würde ich sagen, können wir vielleicht anfangen um 16:03 kann man das schon machen, ne? Ich denke, dass, die meisten Leute auch jetzt einfach wieder da sind. Wer Lust hat, darf auch gerne seine Kamera anmachen. Und ich freue mich total, dass wir viele Gäste hier haben mitten am Tag. Elisabeth Otto zu begrüßen in unserem Zoom-Zimmer. Und Libby Otto hat Kunstgeschichte studiert, also ist keine Architektin und, hat dann den Master gemacht, ne, ihre wissenschaftliche Ausbildung zur Kulturhistorikerin. Da können wir für uns vielleicht noch was von lernen, was sozusagen die feinen Unterschiede sind. Hast du eigentlich schon ich muss das hier leider so ablesen, weil ich es also nicht auswendig lernen konnte. Hast du schon die Dissertation über Fotomontage in der Weimarer Republik, abgelegt, ne? Das ist also so im Grunde ein Forschungsfeld, glaube ich, wirklich inhaliert. Und jetzt bist du Professorin, ähm, in Buffalo und Direktorin des Humanities Institut, Professorin für Kunstgeschichte und Direktorin des Humanities Institut. Und was das genau ist, glaube ich, würde ich mich auch wahnsinnig für interessieren. Und vor allen Dingen hast du aufregende Bücher herausgebracht, die wir teilweise, würde ich sagen, auch wirklich kennen. Also das ist jetzt, das, das sind ja auch es ist noch nicht ganz Magdalena Droste, ne, aber auf dem Weg dahin wirkliche, auch Longseller, essenzielle Bücher herausgebracht. Und, das neueste Buch ist Queer Bauhaus. Vielleicht sprichst du darüber auch.
Ja, kann ich machen. Und ist es okay, wenn ich das auf Englisch mache, weil Deutsch für Alltag, mein Deutsch ist gut, aber meine wissenschaftliche Arbeit mache ich auf Englisch. Also ich glaube, ist das okay so auf
Ja, man glaubt es nicht ganz. Man denkt, du könntest das lässig auf Deutsch auch machen, aber es ist selbstverständlich total okay.
okay, gut.
Und jetzt
Gut.
mache ich dich noch zum Host. Warte.
Okay,
Und dann kann man den Co-Host und jetzt kannst du den Bildschirm teilen.
okay, gut.
Und ich wünsche viel Spaß. Wir freuen uns.
Dankeschön. Ich freue mich auch. Okay, sieht man meinen Bildschirm jetzt? Okay, super. Gut, ja, also ich bin es stimmt schon, dass ich keine Architektin bin. Ich bin zwar mit einem deutschen Architekt verheiratet, also ich habe das dann auch vielleicht dadurch ein bisschen inhaliert. Ich glaube, ich werde wirklich zum Englisch wechseln, weil es ist einfach ein bisschen es gibt mir viel mehr Tiefe in meine Sprache auf Englisch. Okay, so, um, thank you, first of all, for this invitation. I'm really happy to speak to everyone about this. This is all of these projects that I've worked on, and I'll mention a few briefly, are things that I was really interested in, even from that dissertation, which was on photo montage, but had a chapter on Mariana Brandt. And I was not originally particularly interested in the Bauhaus because, like most people, I think I had sort of learned that surrealism was the exciting modern movement and Bauhaus was the boring one, which, you know, the more I was in the Bauhaus Archive doing research for this one chapter of my dissertation, the more I realized that that what I'd learned didn't make any sense with the objects I was seeing. And so this was, oh, I'm being asked to admit people. Uda, can you see them too? Okay, should I admit them or, okay, we're co-hosts, good. So I think I just started doing more. There were so many artists I had never heard of that there was very little work on, although often, you know, there's a small catalog or something done. You know, Germany has such wonderful traditions of, you know, local Freundeskreisen, you know, who support local artists. So I try to draw on that work. That kind of thing rarely makes it, especially into English. You know, having English as my first language means in a way that some of what I'm doing is translating smaller conversations that are happening in German, and giving those people credit too in the footnotes. So always look at my footnotes if you can. So what I'd like to, so right, the story I ended up writing for Haunted Bauhaus was one that basically focused on the weird in the Bauhaus, the interesting. And I situate it largely as a Lebensreformbewegung rather than a design movement, although it is many things. There were 1,253 people at the Bauhaus. So there are a lot of different stories you can tell. And as we were talking about a little bit, for those of you who are listening before the hour, there's one story of the Bauhaus that I think has become quite fixed, and a lot of what I'm aimed at doing is unfixing that. And a good way to do that is to bring women into the story a lot more, also gay and lesbian Bauhaus members. The subtitles you can see here of my book, the first part is Occult Spirituality. So I'm interested in the religious experiments that were a key part of the Bauhaus. Mazda's Nan, you've probably been following, was so influential at the school, but they were also interested in, general mishmash of everything from spiritualism, the belief that the dead never really leave us and that ghosts are around us. They were interested in palmistry, astrology, yoga, so everything from just kind of daily practices to real beliefs. And this persists, as I argue in that first chapter, all the way through the book. And then the end of the book goes to the political, which often, because of the Cold War, I think because of Walter Gropius being in this country during the Cold War, anything political was really repressed in stories of the Bauhaus. It's really, again, presented as kind of sachlich, as a style. And what I was seeing in the archives were that people were totally excited about communism, and that was a huge part of the Bauhaus. But I also, and I'm not the only one to say this, was interested in the fact that there were Nazi members of the Bauhaus. And that's actually, we could talk about that during the question and answer. That's my next project, is to really focus on, okay, not only did a lot of Bauhaus members not leave Germany after 1933, in fact, some of them worked for the regime. And in fact, one of them was in charge of Bauleitung for the construction of crematoria and gas chambers at Auschwitz, where several of his Bauhaus colleagues were murdered. So, there's a lot more to tease out there, and that starts a little bit with this book, and I'm continuing it now. Okay, so let me just show you some pictures. You probably don't need this, but this is just kind of a backdrop of thinking about what Bauhaus looks like. When I show this to people in the US, I point to this and I say, it's still standing and you can go and stay overnight. And they are completely enchanted with this idea. You guys probably know that. I have learned from being there that the Prela house was very hellhörig. So if there's a party going on downstairs, you're probably going to go. So that was an interesting research discovery there. Right. So a lot of my work is draws on, as I mentioned before, research. A lot of it's archival and original, but I do look at research that sometimes only has a very small print run. And I also have collaborated with a lot of people. So Patrick Rossler and I co-wrote Frauen am Bauhaus, and we had a few guest essays in that. Magdalena Droste did a great one on let me think of her name. It'll come back to me later. But she actually did like Formgebäck, like cookies, in a sort of, actually they're not Bauhaus style at all. They're very stylized. So that's a great essay in that. And there's a blog that she wrote also on that artist, whose name will come to me in a minute. There are 40 artists in that book, so sometimes I don't think of them all right at the same second. And then this book on the left is a collection of essays that Patrick Rossler and I edited, and I was hoping actually that there would be more on sexuality. We sent out a call for gender and sexuality. It was really, a lot of it is about women particularly, and somewhat about masculinity, but there wasn't much on queer Bauhaus. But working on these projects, working with other scholars, gave me a pretty deep knowledge of what female Bauhaus members were doing, and that helped me then when I went to work on Bauhaus, haunted Bauhaus, to think about how how to retell this story, not just to say there were women there, but to say what happens when we put them back into the picture. In the Bauhaus Bodies book that I showed you just before on the left, there's one chart that I think is one of the most important things in the book. And this was put together, I had no input here, by Anke Blum, who is at the Stiftung Weimar Classic, and Patrick Rossler. And this is out of their DFG funded project, where they really, working with Magdalena Droste, surveyed who was at the Bauhaus when and what did they study, and if possible, a little bit more. And they created a database that's open. So if you guys want that, you can email me, or I can share the link at the end of my talk. But as you can see here, what it shows that was really groundbreaking is that women were in every single, so the little black numbers are numbers of women in each workshop, and women were in every single workshop and program that the Bauhaus had over time. And this is really important, because the story that had been told then, and I still hear it. In fact, someone started arguing with me, and I was like, no, I've done this work. And she was like, oh, okay. But the story that was circulating before, kind of the feminist version of the Bauhaus, is that women's admission became restricted. That is true. This was not legal, and they had a harder time getting into the institution than their male colleagues did from late 1919 on, or maybe it's 1920, but it's quite early. It's right in that winter. And that they also were all pushed into the weaving workshop. That was the story that was told. And in English, they always say that they were all pushed into the weaving workshop. And you can see quite a lot of them went into the weaving workshop. We know anecdotally, a lot of them went in when they weren't planning to. And some of them, like Gertrude Arndt, who I'll speak about later in my talk, eventually left it. Probably she was good at it, but it just wasn't really her calling. But we see, architecture, 40 women, that's not nothing, only less than a third of all women at the Bauhaus were in the weaving workshop. So it's a sizable number, but it's certainly not everything. Okay, so I've said a bit about Haunted Bauhaus. What I'll speak to you about today is material from my third chapter called Bauhaus Women in Transformation, and the fourth chapter on a queer Bauhaus. All right, so this is a picture that appeared in Die Form, which many of you will know was the Werkbund's journal. And it was an article authored by someone named Renate Richter-Green. This is one other side problem of working on women artists, is often their names change several times during the course of their work, so they're sometimes harder to trace. She came to the Bauhaus named Anna Niemeyer, so that name has nothing to do with anything of her later names. And Kurt Schwitters actually gave her the nickname Ray, and she married Hans Richter, so she was Renate Richter-Green. She also worked as Ray Green as a journalist. Eventually, she became Ray Suppot, and that was the name she had for the longest period in her adult life. So I collect all those names and this person under that name. So the drawings were by her, and this is just an excerpt from the text that she wrote to go with it. Actually, you guys, I translated it into English. Yeah, no, the text I'm saying isn't on the slide, so you'll have to listen to me in English on it. A dress is not there for its own sake, but to be worn. Today, 90% of all women work, and these 90% need rational clothing. Life is in perpetual motion. Preferences for line, color, and attitude change, and these penchants also differ for each person. It must be a matter of fulfilling the specific demands of a dress's utility. This is the central problem of today's fashion, fashion for the 90% of women. And so what she created, and at this point she was working in Paris, she had a clothing design studio. She created what she called the transformation dress, das Transformationskleid, where you'd buy a basic kind of sheath here, and it would come with a number of accessories so that you could, have a little shawl, scarf thing, a sweater with a belt, a jacket, and you could go straight from work by just buttoning on this longer skirt and go out for the evening. She, from this particular dress, one could make up to 13 different outfits. And she also created weekender versions that had culottes, so a split skirt, so you could go hiking. And the idea is that women are working, these should be affordable clothing. That was important to her, and really stand up to all the strains of modern life. And I take this dress and this interest in transformational design as kind of a signal concept for thinking about what women's work in the Bauhaus was. Certainly, many Bauhaus members were interested in multifunctional design, but I noticed it really quite a lot with Bauhaus women. And to me, it also made sense in relation to the fact that they were often transforming themselves. They were, you know what? I left my email open, so it's going to chime sometimes because it's not going to let me out of this screen to stop it. So they were transforming themselves during this period of Die Neue Frau, and a lot of change in women's lives, right? There's enfranchisement that they get the vote. And they end up then often kind of adapting within the institution and outside of it because of the vicissitudes that they encountered often. So Ré Supot married the surrealist poet and journalist Philippe Supot, and first she was an experimental filmmaker, but then she taught herself to be a photographer. And they traveled around to Spain on the break of civil war, to Norway's fishing villages, and eventually settled in North Africa, in Tunisia. And he wrote journalistic pieces and she took the photos. They were in Tunisia because Philippe was a part of the resistance, and they lived there for a number of years. And this that I show you is from a series of photographs that are quite extraordinary that she took in Tunisia's reserve quarter, which was where outcast women were kept confined, actually. And she had a police accompaniment, but there's a great kind of empathy that one can really see in these photos of women who sometimes made a tiny bit of money working as prostitutes, but mostly were just outcast from their families and had very little to get by on. So she and Philippe had to flee Tunisia on one of the last buses out of the city as advancing Nazi forces descended. And she had to leave all of her negatives and her camera equipment behind because she very likely would have been shot on the spot if she'd been found with a camera on her. So then this was in 1942, and the subsequent years they were stateless and traveling through North and South America, trying to create a free French media organization to work as a part of the resistance. And this particular photograph really struck me in that context because it looks like a photograph of a woman who is armed and dangerous and about to shoot the viewer. What it actually is a picture from an amusement park in Buenos Aires that she took in 1944, where you shot an air gun, and if you hit the target, it would trip a camera to take your picture. So in this circumstances where she had nothing but, great clothes, because she was a good dresser, she managed to take a self-portrait and to become a photographer again, just for this moment. I also talk about one of the artists that and designers that is just really cool, and she's a part of my new project as well. I think the Bauhaus Archive is working on an exhibition of her work. It's still several years off before they open again, but this, I believe, will be happening, I don't know, maybe 3 or 4, 5 years, something like that. So this is Friedel Dicker, who came to the Bauhaus early on. She was a student of Johannes Itten already in Vienna. And she was one of those really multi-talented Bauhäusler who, did street puppetry in her free time and designed theater sets and costumes and did bookbinding. And she would become the first woman to sign off on a design for a flat roofed building in 1923. It wasn't actually built, but she designed it. So, one of the signature achievements or design elements that's really associated with the Bauhaus, she was kind of a groundbreaker in. She returned to Vienna with fellow Bauhaus member Franz Singer, and they created a design studio, Atelier Singer Dicker, where they did everything from designing toys that are a little bit like Lego, well before Lego. Lego's a post-war development, and it came with instructions so you could make turtle or pelican. But as with Legos, I think many children just made whatever they wanted to. I keep hoping someone will design this again because it would be fun. But they also made these transformable spaces. This multi-purpose, multifunctional design was kind of a signature of their work from everything I've been able to see of it. That one space, they even designed one space where the floor comes up at night and the bed is under the floor, actually, in quite a small apartment. Here you can see a guest house that they designed that during the day functioned as kind of a large lounge room, and at night then the benches here transformed into sleeping spaces, and the entire stairs retracted so that you could pull out the bed and still have your book on the night table and have a very comfortable space. She transformed herself again in the mid-30s as the right was gaining more power also in Austria and right before the Anschluss, and became a member of the Communist Party. It was relatively unusual for women to take on party membership in any party. It was less common, although certainly not unheard of. And she stopped designing and started making photo montages. And the one I show you here is, you can see it split down the middle. That is because she was arrested for her political activities and knew that these photo montages would be a danger to anyone who owned them. So she destroyed them, but before she did that, because she could do kind of anything, she took photographs of them. So we have these negatives that show these monumental photo montages. And in this one, you can probably see, this worker is comforting his starving child, where meanwhile rearmament is happening and crowds are gathering. So, and it says, Das Bürgertum faschiert sich. So she's very concerned about what's going on. There are a lot of stages to her life, and I'm just giving you a quick overview, but she's the one who ended up in Theresienstadt concentration camp and ghetto. And so when you see images of art done by children in Theresienstadt, they are almost invariably her students. She taught 500 students using Bauhaus methods as a kind of proto-art therapy within the institution. And before she was deported to Auschwitz, at her own insistence, because she wanted to follow her husband who had gone before her and who was a skilled carpenter, so he was being brought there to work. She packed up over 2,000 of her students' drawings, and they were hidden in the eaves of one of the dormitories at Theresienstadt and found after the war. And that's the collection that is in the Jewish Museum in Prague and sometimes is exhibited. This is just here a quick watercolor that she apparently, the story was from the man who had it that she just grabbed his notebook and kind of dashed this off quite quickly. So, again, we see how she transforms as an artist and designer over time, but also I think we get a very different picture of what Bauhaus goes on to do when we put women into it, to think of it as connected to art therapy. And indeed, one of her students actually became one of the founders of the art therapy movement in the US, is something we generally don't do. She herself was murdered in Auschwitz upon her arrival. So, in her mid 40s, that was the end of her career, but there's quite a legacy out of it. Okay, and the last of the women I'll talk about before I move on to talk a bit about a queer Bauhaus is Gertrude Arndt, who is the one I mentioned before. She is from Erfurt and she really wanted to be an architect. She was a part of the Wandervogelbewegung, was used to her independence. This was a hiking and outdoors movement, youth self-reliance. And she trained in an architect's office, including learning photography while she was there. And went to the Bauhaus then in Weimar to really become an architect. And she was one of those many women who was dissuaded from that path. She took one course, but went into the weaving workshop. And I should say the weaving workshop, while I was saying not all women were pushed in there, my understanding of it is it was a pretty cool place. There wasn't great instruction there when it opened up. There were these looms there, and Ulrike Müller has done great work tracing the history of these looms and how they came to be in the Weimar Bauhaus. And so the young women who were in this workshop did a lot to build contacts with other weaving and dyeing and other things, related to weaving, where they could go and get exterior training and bring it back. And Gunther Stürzel is, of course, as you guys have been reading, the most important of these. And I think she did a lot also to create a very collaborative, wonderful atmosphere. So Gertrude Arndt designed and wove this rug that was on the floor of the director's office during the 1923 Bauhaus exhibition. She was particularly known for her color work. So in 1926, she sat for her Gesellenprüfung and passed it, and decided that day that she would never weave again. She was tired of it, didn't particularly like it, and so she quit. She left the Bauhaus with Alfred Arndt, who was a fellow student, and they married, and he worked as an architect. I think it's pretty certain that she helped him, though there is not documentation of that. They returned to the Bauhaus then in 1929, and he became one of the junior masters of the Jungmeister, they were often called, of the Bauhaus. And she could easily have returned to the weaving workshop and just helped out or done some teaching. She decided not to, and instead she took up photography. She called herself, from the time or when she was looking back, a do-nothing, a Nichtstuerin, and decided to kind of, in my estimation, embrace this identity by making a series of photographs called mask portraits, where she's often, interestingly, surrounded by, sometimes almost drowning in fabric, which had been the medium of her work prior to this point. And she seems to pick up elements of the past. Sometimes there are Victorian looking fabrics or even a Victorian look, but she doesn't actually seem particularly interested in the past. And I write about this in the chapter in relation to Jack Haberstam's notion of a queer art of failure. So queerness, very broadly, is a term that Eve Sedgwick talked about as not something we have to see as tied only to same-sex desire, but as embracing the strange, as a term that has roots actually in the early 19th century of, the other, the unusual, as it has connotations of sexuality and desire as well. And Jack Haberstam writes about the queer art of failure as embracing failure, as embracing uh, the doing nothing, the being unproductive, denying the positivity of the future, and as this being an area in which, as Jack says, queers have excelled. And I think of Gertrude Arndt's mask photos as kind of, once she's back in the middle of the Bauhaus, which is an institution that's very much oriented towards the future, towards, this belief that if we could just design it right, then it will bring equality, it will bring ease in daily life, it will bring all kinds of good things. And in these photographs, she really says, or not, or I don't try to make a better design future through rugs or whatever. Maybe I just make these weird photographs all by myself in my basement, which is what she was doing. All right, so with that, let me turn to, that's kind of the conclusion of chapter 3, and I'll talk, I want us to have time to talk, so I won't speak too long about the queer Bauhaus, but I do want to give you a sense of how I lay this out and what I think this work does. So I start the chapter with this double portrait of Heinz Löh and Hermann Trinkhaus, which was another find in the archives, in the Bauhaus archives, where I was looking at it and saying like, okay, experimental photography, we can see it's in a Dessau atelier. This Sabine Hartmann, who was a longtime photo archivist in the Bauhaus archive, did great work and just sent me like all these photographs that different people had taken in their atelier. So we can identify the sink, we can identify the structures. They're surrounded by Bauhaus archives. Here's a Hocker by Marcel Breuer. And, this is the kind of work that I talk about in chapter 1, a kind of spirit photograph where figures are present and absent, where it's, a technical photography move to do a double exposure, but it allows for this kind of ghostly presence. And in this particular image, what the ghostly presence seems to be is, in the words of Oscar Wilde, the love that dare not speak its name, right? I mean, these two men one is caressing the other's face. He seems to be holding an object and one really can't tell quite what it is, but he's certainly, seems to be reaching out to him. These are Hans Löh's hands, but it looks almost like they could be holding hands. It's hard to tell where one's body stops and the other ends. But this fainter figure of Hermann Trinkhaus, who was only in one of the exposures, is both there and not there. So I read this as a photograph giving us kind of plausible deniability, so that if we look at this and see this as an image of desire between men and either attribute that to our own thoughts, that like, maybe we ourselves are having queer thoughts, or to the artist, that he was having queer desires, well, he's not really there. And actually he's contained in this glass structure. And isn't that funny, because his name is Trinkhaus? So it has this kind of jokiness to it about something that also seems quite serious in it. It does both of these things at the same time. And I think this kind of stands in for a lot of what we can say about a queer Bauhaus. I found no evidence that the institution was particularly open to gay and lesbian students. In fact, I found, this is just background to point out, Magnus Hirschfeld's Institute for Sexual Science, Institut für Sexualforschung, I think, or Wissenschaft in German, has the same years as the Bauhaus, 1919 to 1933. So even though gay male homosexuality is illegal under paragraph 175, there's a lot being talked about in Germany at this time. And there's a very lively, kind of famously so, queer scene in Berlin. And this is the indomitable Lotte Hamm, who ran a great lesbian club, Damenball mit Windbeutel Wettessen. I think that is, I quite like that. And this picture I would use to stand in for something for which I have no pictures, which was an application to the Bauhaus that was made. And again, I apologize for the chiming. I just can't stop it unless I stop the whole sharing with you. It was an application made to the Bauhaus early on by a prospective student who had all of the qualifications that we would usually want for, or that the admissions committee would have sought for a Bauhaus member. So this person was named Hans Volker. And in 1920, he listed on his they did a sort of letter form, Lebenslauf, that he had already studied significantly painting and sculpture. And the letter ended with the lines, "Since the end of September of this year, I have permission from the authorities to wear men's clothes, a permission which I am now using." And it was signed Hans Volker, also known as Johanna Volker. So this was a student who was applying who we would now call trans. And what we can see in the files, all we can see is that this student was rejected. So that really doesn't make sense in the context of the student's qualifications. The only thing we can conclude is that very likely this was a case where someone was not welcome because of their sexuality and their sexual identification. So, I want to say clearly, it's not that the Bauhaus was particularly nurturing of queer people, but art schools, queer kids often find art schools, and the Bauhaus made itself a beacon for the new and the possible. And so queer people did find their way there. I should also say that doing these histories, what I found, I gave a presentation once, and Oliver Botar, who is a good friend, he's also a Bauhaus Moholy-Nagy scholar, he said, "That's it?" And it took me years to put together the few people I'll talk about now. There are a few more in the book. And there was a lot of destruction of people self-protecting, families thinking they were protecting them. The Nazi period, was not initially a homophobic regime, but it became it with a vengeance. So a lot of work went into the little bit I'll tell you about here. So two of the figures that we can identify as definitely queer are Max Pfeiffer-Wattenpohl and Florence Henry, who were good friends, as you can see here. And he came to the Bauhaus in 1919. So already in its first year, we have a confirmed gay man at the Bauhaus. And he's remembered for these paintings, which I think are fine, but I don't adore them. But he was prolific with them, so there's that. But he also did one single major weaving, this slit tapestry. He had a special status at the Bauhaus because he was already a painter with gallery representation. And so he could just go to different workshops and work there for a while. And you might have noticed in the slide I showed you where it broke down workshop membership by gender, that there were men, a few men, I think about 11 in total, who over the 14 years of the Bauhaus studied in that workshop, but it was quite rare for men to be there. And one thing one constantly hears when this work is hanging, it's often hung in the Bauhaus archive, which owns it, is that this emphasis of like, this is the only one he did, which seems to be kind of a gender policing of, him having stepped out into what I call medium drag. Actually, this is a kind of experimentation with a mode that was really coded as feminine at the Bauhaus. But he also did photographs like this. And these photos actually ended up in the collection, the Kirchbach collection, the industrialist, a Nazi supporter. So they had quite an interesting history, but these, I think it's through his photography that Max Pfeiffer-Wattenpohl taps into the visual iconography of the gay underground. This one was in the collection of Joseph Alpers, and as I note here, it was formerly attributed to Joseph Alpers, much to the confusion of people working in the Alpers archive. If you know his work, it's, you know, he's famous for the homage to the square and things like that. So it was helpful to them to sort this out. And then in the Bauhaus archive, there are photographs like this, which actually are not reprinted in the collected photography works of him. The family, I think, edited them and did not put them in. But there's a whole series of this young Italian man that are, you know, very overtly about desire. And they're no longer about a kind of queer performativity, but just straight up desire. And this little piece of a bed in the background, I always think of it as they say in a movie, when you see a gun, it's going to go off. So the context is very, very clear here. Florence Henry went by the Bauhaus briefly to visit some friends and ended up staying, and she was auditing only. She studied with, as far as we can tell, Lucia Maholi, who was sometimes taught people photography there. Photography wasn't yet a workshop. That was actually quite late in the institution's life that photography was officially taught there. And she, I could say a lot about her, but I will keep it short. She ended up becoming really a great photographer, and her works have this clarity, this strong design element, but here in this self-portrait, I think it's particularly interesting that she is both so present and completely absent. And to me, it reads about kind of the difficulty of picturing a lesbian subjectivity at this time, right? Like she's there, but she's not there in the way we expect her. This is a photograph of her partner, Margareta Schall, who was also a Bauhaus weaver. They lived together in Paris after leaving the Bauhaus. And similarly, we see these mirrors and architectural elements shown to both picture her and kind of destabilize our ability to locate her anywhere specifically. She's also in a different way kind of present and absent. This is Ray Richter, later Ray Suppot, who did the transformation dress. And we have these kind of Bauhaus circles of affiliation that often were in some way or another kind of queer. And so this is a really erotic portrait of her where, you know, the net is both just kind of a casual fabric element, and it has connotations, I think, of S&M because of the netting. But it's also just, you know, a portrait of her friend from the Bauhaus. This is another example of how, if we follow the women, Bauhaus ends up in other places than we expect. This is one of her nudes published in the early 30s in a journal called Paris Magazine, Paris Magazine. And on the cover, it actually, I should have shown you guys the cover. It says like, you know, 40 very audacious nudes. So this is mainstream softcore porn with, you know, some reportage kind of things in it. And a Florence Henry nude ends up in this. She's not the only one there. Germaine Kral published also a photograph in this edition. So, you know, as some of the surrealists did, but, you know, we don't necessarily think of Bauhaus being among the softcore pornographic industry's publications. Okay, I'll just speak very briefly about two last artists to complicate a notion of a queer Bauhaus. Perhaps some of you got a chance to see Margaret Camilla Leiteretz's works. They were shown some in 2019. She did these beautiful abstractions that, you know, this one kind of reminds me a bit of Georgia O'Keeffe almost, with this almost sculptural approach to her, the white line disappearing into space. The name of it is kind of a tip-off that something strange is going on there, because it's called Catenary Curve. Sorry, I have to zoom around, ending at the right edge. So this incredibly dry title. And with each photograph, each painting, she included a graph that she usually tucked into the stretchers on the back of the painting. And all of these are based on scientific graphs. And she also was using the color system taught to her by Josef Alpers. So it's later work, but Bauhaus work. Leiteritz was one of the key players in the Bauhaus wallpaper project, which was tremendously successful and kept the school afloat during the Great Depression. But she also did works then that have, to my mind, a kind of queer content. So she did a book called Amor and Psyche, but rather than pictures like, hang on, like that, which is a more traditional imaging of this scene from myth where the two young lovers are kept apart, she tended to emphasize just this one woman all by herself, kind of leaping off into the unknown. So there's actually pretty much no sign of amour in this book. There's also images of goddesses kind of cuddling together. And I talk about her as a queer singleton. We have a tendency when we do queer studies, if we can't find a male partner for someone historically, to read them as lesbian. And I was starting to do that. There's a number of works like this series that show women together naked, not necessarily, desiring each other. It's quite ambiguous, actually. I started realizing the more I looked into these. But there's also a lot of images like this where it's really about singleness. And there's now something called celibacy studies. There's also singleness studies. And I drew on the work of Andrea Williams, who talks about African-American women in the church and blessed singleness. And one of the few statements we have from Margaret Leiteritz, who became an archivist, is a job application where she states very adamantly, I am single and without attachment and can move to Karlsruhe to take on this job. So I decided to take her word about her identity rather than filling in the blanks with something else. And the last thing I just point out is kind of, part of what drives me to do this work, which is, partially doing right to history, doing right to people and creative people and what drove them, but also kind of as a kind of reconstructive work. So Richard Grune came to the Bauhaus during the early years and actually worked with Gertrude Grunau, who you would have encountered in Magdalena Drosta's book. And she was much more important for the school than she's given credit. And often it was based on how she assessed students, whether or not they were allowed to leave the preliminary course, the Vorkurs, and go on to workshop specialization. After his second semester in the Vorkurs, because he didn't pass the first time, not that unusual, but at the second semester, she wrote of him in a way that to me evoked her witnessing someone struggling with their identity, possibly their sexual identity. And she wrote about him just seeming to be blocked. And she felt that once he figured some things out about himself, he'd be freer as an artist. After that time, he left and became a graphic designer. He was very involved in socialism and helped make this book about the Children's Red Republic, which was an autonomous children's camp, socialist children's camp. And the graphic design work that he and Niels Brodersen did for the cover, for example, and other parts of it really, I think, make it kind of, both playful and really dynamic. And this is actually my copy that I bought off of Abe Books in the US. It's a keepsake that those who emigrated during the Nazi period often brought with them because it was really kind of a life-changing experience. So after 1933 or during 1933, he, like a number of Bauhaus members, was involved in underground resistance publications, anti-Nazi publications. He was arrested in 1934, but not for that work. He was arrested for having, quote, a loud gay party in his apartment. So it was specifically under the terms of paragraph 175. And he spent most of the rest of the Nazi period in concentration camps. He survived, but he was never compensated for what he had suffered because the Bundesrepublik did not compensate. The paragraph 175 was still illegal, and so there was no compensation, there was no recognition, but he turned back to his art skills to memorialize what he and others had suffered in a whole series of lithographs. There are a few copies in Germany, and there's one at the National Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. And this is, it's called Bock in German. It, it looks like a scene of gang rape, so which is quite possible that he also endured, and I think could be bound up within this image. But it's a particular kind of torture that was reserved for usually for non-Jewish inmates in concentration camps. And he also depicted just the very difficult daily life of the prisoners. So it's through his, Bauhaus trained skills that he's able to give voice to something that he's not being given any kind of comfort for. So I think, that's about all I would like to say. Just in conclusion, I'd remark that I hope you'll agree that when we bring women back into the center of things, when we bring queer identities and sexuality back into the center of thinking about the Bauhaus, what we come up with is a much more interesting and much richer history of what Bauhaus was and what it could do. So with that, I will stop sharing, and questions in either language are great. Just give me 1 second to move. Zoom is being difficult, but I will make it work. Okay, here goes with the stop share. Okay, thank you very much. Thanks.
Ja, ganz toll.
Danke.
Vielen Dank. Von mir, wir können gerne auch noch alle 40 anderen Biografien hören. Ja, also ich stelle eine Frage. Warum ist Marianne Brandt nicht vorgekommen?
Wegen Zeit. Ich habe abgekürzt.
Und ich dachte auch nämlich ansonsten, weil sie ist eigentlich im Grunde in diesem Level der Hierarchien oder wie soll man das sagen, an einem Erkennungslevel, nicht? Ist ja Marianne Brandt vielleicht sogar die Frau, die noch am ehesten als Frau genannt wird, also als Name, der einem bekannt ist, weil sie es eigentlich wie ein Mann fast geschafft hat, ne? So,
Ja.
das dachte ich, sei dann vielleicht der Grund gewesen, dass es ein Level weitergeht. Und ich bin ganz begeistert von dem Vortrag und auch von diesem, also ich meine, du hast 2 Bücher vorgestellt und 2 Themen vorgestellt, aber sie gehen nahtlos ineinander über. Eigentlich, ich habe auch aus Versehen, Entschuldigung, ich habe gesagt Queer Bauhaus. Ich meinte natürlich Haunted Bauhaus, aber in der Vereinfachung. Also vorausgeschaut würde ich noch mal kurz sagen, noch ein anderes Thema zu dem Thema Hellhörigkeit des Prellerhauses in Dessau. Wir waren da nämlich auch mit unseren Studierenden und alle Studierenden sind ganz gestresst gewesen, weil sie so eine schöne Party gemacht haben im Zimmer über meinem Zimmer. Und ich finde es schön, dass jemand anderes und nicht nur ich auch sagt, wie hellhörig. Es verstärkt alle Geräusche, dieses Haus. Das hat jetzt so ein bisschen meine Reputation posthum gerettet. Aber das ist nur ganz nebenbei. Ich habe 2 Worte aufgeschrieben, weil ich natürlich auch nochmal, also es ist nochmal eine Überhörung jetzt für uns, das auf Englisch zu hören, den Vortrag, in einem sehr schönen American English. Eine Nix-Tourerin, Das musste ich gleich mitschreiben. Das ist,
Und
es heißt ja eigentlich eine Nichtstuerin und das ist eher negativ, auch in meiner Erziehung noch negativ konnotiert. Und da ich war so ganz ergriffen, weil schon über das Nix-Tuerin hat es schon ein Level der Sympathie erreicht. Und dann mit den Bildern, jetzt muss ich sogar sagen, müsste ich jetzt kurz nachgucken, wie die Dame hieß, äh, die Nix-Tourin Bilder, Fotos propagiert hat.
das
Moment.
Gertrud Arndt.
Ja, war Gertrud Arndt, ne? Hier ist auch dieses fantastische Maskenfoto in dem Buch. Und also das zu genießen und zu zelebrieren, ich glaube, das ist vielleicht auch ein Übergang dieser beiden Themen. Aber es wird einem natürlich auch sofort klar, warum das unterbunden wurde, ne? Also vom politischen System. Ja, ganz, ganz hervorragend. Und dann in deinem Buch ist hier auch noch ein von Jushka Banki, die ich gar nicht kannte. Die you don't honestly think a woman can build a house. I can't imagine it anyway, sagt die Frau. Das versetzt uns nochmal, glaube ich, in diese Zeit, ne? Denn die Bilder, die wir jetzt hier gesehen haben, sind ja in unserer Zeit okay, also gar nicht radikal, ne, was die Frauen gemacht haben, aber dass es 100 Jahre früher bereits alles da war, aber nicht ausgesprochen werden durfte, das ist so radikal.
Ja, und Shushka Banki wird ein von mehreren Frauen, die vorgestellt sein sollte im Herbst in Weimar. Es gibt eine Ausstellung namens Vergessene Frauen des Bauhauses, was Patrick Rossler und Anke Blum kuratieren. Ich helfe ein bisschen mit. Ich schreibe über Lotte Rothschild. Und also es wird bald noch mehr zu sehen geben, vielleicht. Aber viel ist, there's almost nothing left of what she did. That's why there's in that book only photographs of her.
Hm. Und wenn, also es gibt ja die Schülerinnen am Bauhaus und dann gibt es ja auch noch die Frauen der Meister. Wie würdest du das, was wäre dein Kommentar dazu?
Ja, Mercedes Valdivieso hat einen ganz toller Aufsatz geschrieben für Bauhaus Bodies. And she starts with a quote from Lucia Maholi saying, Lucia Maholi, who wrote quite a lot of history, she separated, divorced from Mahoy-Nagy. And often I think many of Mahoy-Nagy's texts were co-authored with her. His German was not that great as a Hungarian, but they also talked a lot. And she didn't particularly seek fame, although she did want to correct the historical record. And Lucia Maholi wrote, sometimes someone should do a history of the Meisterfrauen am Bauhaus. And so Mercedes's essay really focuses on Isa Gropius, and who in some ways was a designer herself. She's the most important chronicler of the Bauhaus from when she marries Walter Gropius, and she keeps a diary of the Bauhaus. So there's a lot that we know of daily events because of her. But she also was charged with designing the kitchen of the master house that the Gropiuses had, which was, kind of a model house in Dessau once it opened in 1926. And she read contemporary designers and design advice on kitchens and home design, and she got industrial elements for that kitchen because she couldn't find what she wanted elsewhere. So that's just an example, but yeah, the wives of the masters were often unpaid masters themselves to a certain extent. Lucia Maholi photographed the products of the school and you know, helped make them available for sale. Marianne Brandt actually was, you know, an acting director, but it was of her own choice, supposedly not to just be made master. Gunther Stutzer, as you all probably read, had to really fight, even though she was doing exactly the same work for the same title and then for the same money for her work. So, you know, I see it as glass half full history of women at the Bauhaus, but certainly, you know, it was not a bastion of gender equality, I think. Wenn das deine Frage antwortet. Ich
Ja,
weiß.
ja. Ja. Na, es gibt, also ich glaube, dass unter diesem Begriff des weiblichen Narzissmus ja die Bauhaus-Meister-Ehefrauen natürlich auch, also zwar in dieser Rolle waren, im Schatten zu stehen, aber natürlich als Meister-Ehefrau auch eine selbstgewählte Position on top ja auch gehabt haben. Und das würde mich interessieren, auch wie Sie zu den Schülerinnen gestanden haben, ob Sie da Support gegeben haben oder das weiß ich nicht, wie ich das
Ja,
formulieren soll. Ne?
ja, ja, ob die Konkurrenten waren oder
Das würde es
um,
mich auch noch interessieren.
I think it's probably as it is now. It just really depends on the people. You know, we have this case of Lucia Maholi helping Florence Henri to learn photography. She seemed to have been. She was a communist. She seemed just generally to have been cooler, I think. If we look at someone like Habat Baya, who was like the biggest ladies' man. He really got around town. You know, Irena Baya, I think, suffered because they were married, they had a child, they had a meaningful work partnership, I think a meaningful life partnership, but he was unfaithful all the time with his fellow students, with seemingly anyone, as far as I can tell. I mean, he was a good-looking man and he knew how to use it. You know, Walter Gropius, I think, was really dedicated to Isa Gropius, as far as I can tell. And that was quite the partnership, you know, quite a typical case, as we see, of many architects and leaders, right? The old saying that they say in English, I think it's a saying in German too, you know, behind every great man is a great woman. He was an unbelievable correspondent. He was in touch with everyone and really situated the Bauhaus, kept it safe in some ways through his contacts. And the reason he could do that is that Isa Gropius was a beautiful writer and could type. So, you know, she took care of most of that part of things, and it went under his name or sometimes both of their names. But so if the couple stayed together, you know, that worked out for her. In a case like Lucia Maholi, Robin Schuldenfrei has written about her battle to get her photographs back. Walter Gropius, she had to flee to England, and Walter Gropius just kept her negatives and did not tell her he had them. And this really impacted her ability. She could not prove that she was a photographer and thus could not be recognized as a photographer in England and couldn't work in her field. And he lied to her. So, you know, a woman who kind of left the bonds that had brought her to the Bauhaus originally, I think, was, you know, kind of left to her own devices and not necessarily given that much support. So.
Und warum hat das eigentlich getan?
Weil die Fotos, das war seine Architektur und sah das als seins und wollte dann die negativen haben, Sachen zu veröffentlichen von diesen Glasplatten dann direkt. Irgendwann hat sie es mitbekommen und ich glaube, sie hat die Hälfte zurückbekommen. Sie musste aber einen Rechtsanwalt einschalten und so weiter.
Darf ich was fragen?
Ja, auf jeden Fall.
Ich muss nämlich gleich leider gehen, aber ich habe eine Frage, also vielen Dank für den super, super spannenden Vortrag. Ich habe auch schon Text von ihm gelesen. Ich wusste nur vorher nicht, dass Sie das heute sind. Ja, deshalb die Frage kommt mir jetzt auch eher spontan, ist aber eine sehr spezifische Frage. Und zwar bin ich darüber gestolpert, dass diese Thesen von Otto Weininger vom Männlichen und Weiblichen und diese Vorstellung, dass das weibliche, was auch immer, Wesen nicht wirklich künstlerisch kreativ sein kann, dass das noch sehr weit verbreitet, also dass es eine sehr weit verbreitete Vorstellung war und dass Hubert Hoffmann zum Beispiel hat auch so ganz unbedarft geschrieben in irgendeiner Erinnerung, ja, und zum Schluss selbst bei Hannes Meyer noch, wir haben die Schriften von Weininger gelesen über das männliche und das weibliche Prinzip. Und mich würde interessieren, haben Sie da eine Vorstellung oder ein Bild davon, wie durchdringen, also wie weit diese Vorstellung wirklich so Mainstream war oder wie das so gewertet wurde oder ob man da auch eine kritische Distanz zu hatte zu solchen Thesen?
Ja, ja, sehr
Ja.
gute Frage. Ja, gemischt. I mean, we see. I think Itten at one point also said, women are not necessarily as artistically gifted. People often quote Schlemmer. What was it? Wo Wolle ist auch das Weib heißt
Das
es, ne?
Vibe, ja.
Das Weib,
Wo
so ist
Wolle
das.
ist, ist auch das Vibe.
Und ob es noch zum Zeitvertreib or something like that. Suppose he was very good friends with Gunther Stutzel, and it was supposedly a joke. But people cite that and say, like, oh, those Bauhaus men were so mean. So I think it was in people have said, the Bauhaus is a child of its time. And so certainly there were ideas about women's capabilities. This was part of the idea of pushing them into the weaving workshop. They're good at das Handwerkliche, they're good with color, repetitive work. But I also think that there were, Moholy-Nagy, I see none of that, of him saying, you can't do it. He was really the one who said to Marianne Brandt, hey, I'm leading the metal workshop. I think you'd be good at that. And it was definitely a men's club. She wrote later about how she suffered just being given all the terrible, boring work. And she thought everyone had to do that. But later her friends were like, no, we just wanted you to leave because you're a woman. But she made it and she led the workshop, which I think also was not easy. I think she was constantly made to doubt herself as a leader. So, glass half full. Otto Weininger was being read, and those ideas, you see them coming up periodically also among some of the leaders. But I think they're generally in dialogue with it, seeing what's going on around them and recognizing really great students among the women too. And one thing I often, when I think about, would we say the Bauhaus was a particularly sexist institution for its time? I think for its time, it was less sexist than the rest of the world. And one of the ways we can see this is that some of the women, like Marianne Brandt, thrive within the institution and have a hard time afterwards. She was head of design for Ruppel. She did some really cool stuff, but this was not like this was seen as, small town design. And after that, she was unable to get work. And really, she does a series of absolutely terrible paintings in the Nazi period that, I think just like the wind had gone out of her sails, and so that's a kind of complicated answer to your question, but I think definitely those ideas were circulating for sure. And I guess a last thing I would say is some of the women were interested in these ideas, as we still see now in New Age movements. Some of the women might have said like, well, I have this nurturing side of myself to give, or they might have tapped into that too. Some of them really wanted to say, no, I am the same, I can do everything you can. And some of them embraced difference as a source of their creativity too. So for better or worse, I'm mostly just interested in seeing what they thought and what they did, I guess, rather than than judging, than going back and saying, you're sexist. But it's important to know what they were thinking and why. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Ich dachte, Lars, da kommt noch eine Antwort.
Well, I think it's always a bit difficult for us to imagine the social conventions of the times and, you know, evaluate what was unusual, what was common. So, yeah.
But I think we still see this now, you know, I mean, there is this sort of daily sexism still floating around. I mean, maybe being back in the US, I'd say it's different, right? Like there are some things here that really bother me. I lived outside of the US for so long that I know there are lots of different ways to do it. But, you know, the word Rabenmutter I had to learn in Germany. We don't have a term like that, you know? So I think these ideas about gender and ability and, you know, predilections are still, so often I think we're not so different from them even 100 years later. Maybe I'm wrong though.
Ja, das ist
Maybe the way we read, I don't know, or nowadays gender texts are read. Back then they read Otto Weininger because it was a much discussed text on gender or, yeah, sexuality, whatever.
That's right. If they'd had Judith Butler, then it would have been much better.
Yeah. Because they seem to have read this and discussed this a lot. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, but people like what, Helena Stucker, there was who's that famous Russian Soviet feminist? Somewhere I came across a mention of people reading her. I'm forgetting her name, but you know, they were reading also, some people were reading some actual feminist work at the time on, you know, the question of women, the question of the enfranchisement of women was really something they were thinking about, right? I mean, 1919, there's record numbers of women voting. And it goes down after that because suddenly women realize that the vote doesn't change everything. You know, or Rosa Luxemburg as a leader. I think these were some of the things they were thinking about as well.
Ja.
Thank you. I'm afraid I have to leave. Thank you very
danke,
much.
Lars, für die schönen Fragen.
Danke, Oda.
Stock ist auch ein sehr geschätzter Kollege, ein Landschaftsarchitekt.
Oh, schön.
Was man an seinem Poster auch sehen kann.
I actually have you mentioned Oliver Botha. I'm in touch with him for a book contribution. He's contributing to something I'm editing. So.
Oh, that's great. I was on a Zoom call with him recently and he said, I have to work on a book contribution.
Ah, good. Very good.
Yeah,
probably not mine.
He taught his first seminar at Queen's University when I was a master's student, and so I took that seminar. So we've been friends since 25 years. I guess.
Haven't met him yet. It's just because of his work on biocentric modernism.
Yeah, right. He's the groundbreaker.
Thank you. Yeah. Bye.
Bye. Tschüss.
Tschüss.
Ja, ich würde sagen, also ich finde eigentlich den Begriff, der mehrfach gefallen ist, ne, das so zu betrachten, zu sagen, das Glas ist halb voll. Das finde ich eine gute Idee. Und ich meine, wir haben auch immer jetzt in unserer einen Woche, die wir hier uns beschäftigt haben, habe ich immer noch parallel immer mein Geschichtsbuch dazu gehalten, also deutsche Geschichte, um nochmal, man gerät in diese Bauhaus, in Welt, und die ist ganz modern, so, also außer diesen Aspekten, die wir jetzt hier betrachten, aber wenn man das dann quer vergleicht, was sonst los war vor 100 Jahren, dann ist das Glas ja mehr als halb voll, ne? Dann ist es wirklich wunderbar. Und es sind auch viele Männer vergessen worden, die im Bauhaus studiert haben. Wir haben jetzt gerade Anna-Luises Vortrag gehört über den 8 Herren, die nach Palästina ausgewandert sind, und diese Namen sind auch in der Bauhaus-Forschung nicht von Erwähnung, erst dann später, als sie in Palästina tätig wurden. Okay, Anna-Luise guckt schon so, als wäre das nicht ganz korrekt. Bitte?
Nee, alles gut, das war korrekt.
Also zumindest sind sie mir jetzt noch nicht ständig über den Weg gelaufen, ne, diese Namen. So, also das ist schon, aber tatsächlich finde ich sehr eindrücklich war auch dieses Diagramm der Verteilung der Frauen und es gab 40 Frauen in der Architekturabteilung. Ja.
Ja, viel mehr als man hört kaum was von denen.
Das hätte ich nämlich auch, das hat mich jetzt eben, da dachte ich, das hätte ich nicht gedacht.
Hm.
Und jetzt frage ich nochmal Gregor oder Victoria.
Ich hätte auch dazu eine Frage, wenn ich gerade, also weil du gerade meintest, wenn man in die Zeitgeschichte guckt, ist das Glas auch halb voll, aber eigentlich sozusagen ist ja auch viel eher rückwärtsgewandtes Gedankengut auch schon unterwegs. Deswegen wollte ich fragen, ob du vielleicht nochmal, auch wenn das jetzt nicht das Thema des Vortrags war, aber was du rausgefunden hast oder was deine Erkenntnisse waren zu nationalsozialistischen Ideen, die es auch eben am Bauhaus vertreten waren, also inwiefern sich das geäußert hat.
Yeah. In the actual institution, what I wrote in the last chapter is pretty much all I've found, because what I'm working on now is from 33 on. But there was a Swiss student who wrote about going into the canteen and the room really being separated with the lefties on one side and the right wingers on the right side. And so far, let's see. Anna Bloom, I have been wanting to get into the Bundesarchiv. It's not been possible for the past couple of years. But she went through and found all the applications for membership of national in the NSDAP. So she would be able to answer, there's nothing published on it yet. Who took up membership when? So, hopefully I will either be able to find those records or she may share some of that with me, but that's her research right now as a part of this DFG project. But there are people like Fritz Ertel, who already seems to be certainly active in Nazi circles. I haven't been able to find if he has party membership that early. Certainly there were many more communists. And Oda, when you were talking about the Hellhörigkeit, some people have also written, and I pick up this idea as the balconies as a kind of, Sprachrohr, kind of a communication network on the external skeleton of the building. I think that's a really lovely way of thinking of it. And as a place where, as I write in the book, the students weren't allowed to show their communist support. So I think it was list 5 was the communists. And the night before the vote, they turned out the lights so that and lit the lights in different rooms so that the facade of the Bauhaus was a number 5. Or they hung out red bed sheets, things like that. Just happened to all have red bed sheets. So basically, it's a great question. I would say I still don't have enough information about exactly how many there were. I'm hoping maybe for this next book, I'll be able to reconstruct that a bit more once I can get into the archives.
Ja, wir laden dich dann nächstes Jahr wieder ein.
Okay, nächsten Sommer werde ich wahrscheinlich in Deutschland sein.
Alles klar. Ja, wirklich? Ja, dann ich freue mich, dann sehen wir uns.
Okay.
Dann würde ich nämlich, hat noch jemand eine Frage? Gregor?
Ich hätte eine, Victoria.
Ich hätte eine organisatorische Frage. Sie hatten ja gemeint, dass eine Ausstellung noch geplant ist über die Bauhausfrauen. Gibt es schon einen Zeitplan, also ob es noch dieses Jahr stattfinden sollte? Oder?
Ja, es macht am 1. Oktober auf in Weimar. Es wird relativ klein sein, aber mit einem Katalog hoffentlich zweisprachig, aber auf jeden Fall auf Deutsch. Und es heißt Die vergessene Frauen des Bauhaus und befasst sich mit verschiedenen Frauen, die zwischen 33 und 45 gestorben sind. Sprich, manche sind im Holocaust umgekommen, aber es gibt Leute auch wie Frauen wie Alma Siedhoff-Buscher, die in ein Bombenangriff gestorben ist. Also es ist eine andere Art, das zu sammeln. Aber Suska Banki, ich muss überlegen, wer noch. Sophie Corner. I wrote a little bit about Sophie Corner in a Google Bauhaus, a thing for Google Arts and Culture. They wanted me to write about the connections between the Bauhaus and India, and Boris Frevald has done some work on that. What I figured out is, so the Bauhaus's first exhibition outside of Germany was in India, in Calcutta, in 1923. And it included works by Paul Klee, Johannes Itten, Lionel Feininger, and several students, including one named Sophie Corner, who was from Vienna, a painter. And only one work sold, and it was her work. So the first work sold outside of Germany by the Bauhaus in an exhibition was by a woman who's been completely written out of history or forgotten. You know, many of these women didn't seek fame. That's part of the issue. And we've slowly been finding some works. In the middle of work for this exhibition, a woman in Australia contacted me and said, I'm the grandniece of Sophie Corner. I saw you wrote something about her. We found some pictures by her in the garage and had them restored. And then while we were corresponding, she got in touch with other relatives who had another 30 pictures, these brothers, distant cousins of hers. They thought no one had ever heard of her. So we're starting to have a collection of her work. She'll be now included in the exhibition now that there's more work. But I think it's just, you know, there's so much work to do on these women. Lotte Rothschild, who I mentioned, is the one I'm working on. She's another case where we have almost no work left. She also was murdered at Auschwitz. And so I'm trying to use, you know, some sort of advanced, I don't know, interesting theoretical ways of thinking about how we do art history or design history with someone whose oeuvre was destroyed. I'm in touch with, she has one daughter who survived, so I'm in touch with her, but there's really nothing left. So there are photographs of her. That's what we often have of these beautiful young women, is pictures of them, not of what they did. And it's frustrating. So a long answer to your short question, but yeah, October 1st is the opening. Some of the, like Lotte Rothschild's daughter might be coming from France. I'm in touch with her. Esther Banki, who wrote about Zsuzsa Banki, who was, I believe, her aunt. She may be coming. So the opening will be really great, and it'll be up for a couple months. But if you look on Google, they've already started putting up some announcements about it.
Okay, vielen Dank.
Ja, gern.
Ich hätte eine zweiteilige Frage oder ganz global zum Thema, ob das jetzt im Grunde deiner Auswahl geschuldet ist, dass Lucia Moholy immer, oder dass Fotografie und Lucia da auch immer im Fokus stehen, sodass man mutmaßen könnte, dass alles, was queer war am Bauhaus, sich um sie und die Fotografie gruppierte? Oder also ist das der Auswahl geschuldet oder war das tatsächlich so, dass diese Gruppe sich so versammelte?
So she's really important for Florence Henry, but not as much for the others. It's
Okay.
Yeah. So it's there has been more research on Lucia Moholy. So I guess she comes up and she wrote a lot. She wrote the marginal notes to Moholy-Nagy, where she went back and corrected the record on things that were incorrect in his memory or what that people were saying about him. So I use her as a source a lot, but she's really just important for Florence Henry of those, unless I'm misremembering. So yeah, important, but not the organizing principle.
Okay. Okay, ja, weil ich mich fragte, ob es dann auch wieder also übertragbar ist auf das Medium der Fotografie und die selbstreferenzielle Ebene des Fotografierens und dass das Queere sich da eben so concealing abbilden ließ, aber dann hat das mit ihr als Person am Bauhaus nichts zu tun.
Yeah. Not necessarily, although it would be interesting. I mean, her portrait of Florence Henri, which I didn't show, is so intense, right? I mean, they're so in your face, and she is doing queer things. I think to think about the project of her work in relation to queer studies would be really, really interesting. But there's so much more written on her. I think there's more to be done. I know, I think, Robin Schuldenfrei is doing some more work on her because she worked for UNESCO for a lot of years. There's huge bodies of photographic work that she did that haven't really been examined. I think Jordan Troller was also maybe doing some work on her. So there'll be more Lucia Moholy ahead, not necessarily from me, but I'll be reading it with.
Okay, danke schön.
Ja, gern.
Also ich würde sagen, wenn jetzt nicht noch jemand eine sehr dringende Frage hat, dann dürfen wir auch Baby Otto jetzt entlassen nach einem glorreichen Vortrag. Wirklich, es war ganz toll. Auch im Zusammenhang mit Anna-Luises Vortrag, glaube ich, sind sehr stolz und glücklich hier mit unserem Lehrstuhl, wie wir dieses kleine Wort gespreadet haben, würde man auf Neudeutsch sagen, und in die Jetztzeit katapultiert. Und wir haben auch ganz nette Kommentare im Chat mit vielen Dank. Und es war ein Vergnügen, liebe
Danke.
Otto.